Hello, my name is Thomas Longwell. I am a junior at Eastern Washington University, and I'm getting my Bachelor's of Science in Computer Science. Today I'm going to be talking about ransomware. I'm going to be looking at attack trends, tactics that actors use to increase chances of success, and mitigation strategies. So first, I'm going to introduce ransomware, and then I'm going to talk about some of the attacks and vulnerabilities that we're seeing with ransomware. So attacks will be tactics attackers use, and then vulnerabilities will be vulnerabilities attackers exploit um, to make those attacks successful. And then I will go into two case studies to show real world examples of what a ransomware attack looks like or what a third party attack will looks like for the sake of expressing how some of these attacks are played. And then I will go into an observation and discussion of those case studies, what they mean for the larger picture, and then go into the conclusion. So to introduce, what is ransomware? Ransomware is malware that encrypts data on a system, which then bad actors can use to demand a ransom for the decryption key to that encrypted data. So there's actually two types that we've been seeing, which is crypto, which is where the files are encrypted and can't be accessed without that decryption key. Any sort of editing without that key ruins the ability to decrypt that data and can permanently lead to a loss of data. And locker, which is more of a scareware on the lower end of locker, and then on the higher end of locker ransomware, where it's more technical, that locks users out of systems, not allowing them to make inputs, displaying a ransom screen on the locked screen. So the system is locked from the operating system and cannot be accessed. We've also seen impact on businesses and individuals. This can include financial losses, data breaches, which can lead to operational disruptions as well as those financial losses. And that is a big key part of extortion methods that we see relating to triple extortion, which will be talked about later. Another important thing is the hidden cost of a ransomware attack, which can be a drop in share price, a drop in customer trust of that company. They no longer believe that that company will protect their data. And then we can also see that in legal fees as well as um, the cost of time that the company loses and the money that would be invested in the company and the time invested in the company is lost due to the attack. And then another thing that's very important for ransomware right now is an increase in the amount of impacted companies due to higher level attacks as well as third party or um, software chain breaches. So some of the trends that we've been seeing in ransomware in 2021, there was a lot of high target, high profile, big game organizations being targeted. And a good example of this would be the Colonial Pipeline Company, which is what we talked about later as one of the case studies. In the middle of 2021, we actually saw a switch to more middle range targets. This is companies that take in a general amount of 50 to 60 $1 million a year. And we saw this change due to response from authorities. So that would be authorities both cracking down on ransomware attacks and criminals in general. And a key point of that was actually called, it's an organization or a website from CISA known as stopransomware.gov. And that offered rewards for information on attacks. And then we also saw um, that as the cause of unwanted attention from some high profile attacks, such as DarkSide's attack on the Colonial Pipeline, led to ransomware forums blocking the discussion of ransomware as a service. So some other trends that we saw in ransomware would be at the end of 2021, there was an increase in professionalism and the rise of ransomware as a service, where these ransomware groups are developing their own ransomware and then selling the ransomware often for a price to smaller cyber criminals, and then they receive a portion of the profits of successful attacks. We also saw, as part of a rise in professionalism, easier payment options and easier instructions for payment. Usually, they'll use Bitcoin to help make the attacks not trackable. But we saw an increase in easier to pay instructions to make that easier for most people so that ransoms could get paid. And then in 2022, we saw a dip in ransomware attacks. And this was due to several factors, a key one being internal sanctions against Russia for the Ukraine war, and then increased law enforcement pressure. The sanctions in Russia caused a dip because Russian operatives and Russian ransomware criminals weren't able to bring in money from the West due to those sanctions, so they attacked less West targets from the West. And then we also saw a continuation of the targeting of mid-sized companies, but we also saw a lot of third-party vendors being targeted, which will be talked about further in the slides. And then the key industries that we saw being targeted were business services, manufacturing, professional services, education, retail, healthcare, finance, and insurance. The top of that would be business services, manufacturing, and professional services. We saw those being attacked due to a lot of important data being stored in those sectors, making them a good target. For education, retail, healthcare, we saw a lot of those being attacked due to the increased amount of attack surface um, from uh, things going online at the end of 2019 and COVID and online learning, as well as a large amount of data being processed through healthcare, and that led to a larger attack surface to be used, leading to more attacks, as well as that large amount of data being stored made that a real treasure trove for data. And then finance and insurance was on the lower end of being targeted, but the data in those two sections includes a lot of personal data, making them a very, very important target. I'm going to talk about a few attacks and vulnerabilities. So some of the most important ones are infiltration methods, and that needs to be done. That's the precursor to deploying. You need to get into the system, so that's how infiltration occurs. And that's usually by exploiting common vulnerabilities and exposures, also known as CVEs. Some of those will be listed on the next slide. So a very important thing is the email configurations. This will block phishing attacks, which is one of the attack types for infiltration. The first one is domain-based message authentication, reporting, and conformance, DMARC. And then there's domain keys identified mail, DKIM, and sender policy framework, SPF. Sender policy framework is part of a framework that blocks incoming emails that aren't on the same it blocks emails that aren't verified to be on the network, IP addresses that aren't allowed to report on the same network. Domain keys is the same concept. So domain keys blocks domains that aren't allowed on the network. Sender policy looks at who the sender is via IP. Domain keys is based inside of the network. And then those are two components of domain-based message authentication, reporting, and conformance, which block phishing reports, phishing attempts. So another thing that we see in a lot of these common vulnerabilities are leaked credentials or weak security practices. So leaked credentials, obviously passwords, usernames, important details like that. And then weak security practices involve lack of multi-factor authentication, which is where when you enter your password to log in, you get sent a code either via email, your phone, or some other biometric They can even be fingerprints, other things like that. Very important, very basic, but we see a lack of that causing a lot of big issues. And then another one would be open remote access ports in outdated systems. Outdated systems don't get security patches, making them vulnerable to multiple attacks uh, based on CVEs that are released by important organizations such as CISA or the FBI or Meter. And these CVEs get released, and attackers can look at them, anyone can look at them, but outdated systems that aren't patched have these vulnerabilities still in place, and attackers can see that they're not patched and use them. Another recent trend is living off the land techniques, LOTL. These use legitimate OS binaries or scripts or command line prompts that are legitimate to search through and get through systems, which can be a part of privilege escalation and other problems. Another important thing we saw was the rise of Cobalt Strike, which was a tool designed for pen testing and defense, but ended up being retooled by malicious actors to be used as an actual attack tool. And a few important things here, things that really help security would be patching, system updates. This blocks a lot of common vulnerabilities from being used. And then it also blocks a lot of things like remote code execution, which is where the attackers will connect from a different computer to a system and then act as a legitimate user and take advantage of those binaries and command line prompts. On this slide, I'll talk about some common vulnerabilities and exposures. So Meter is kind of the framework that a lot of organizations use to define certain attacks. So the first one being phishing, which is Meter's attack tactic T1598. Phishing is a very prominent attack vector, which is used to get people to click on links or download malware, or just to trick people into giving information to attackers. This can be prevented with the use of those email configurations talked about in the last slide, as well as user training. Attack TA0111 is privilege escalation. This is where bad actors will get into a system using either a guest or a legitimate user account and then escalate their privilege using command line as well as weak security in order to move laterally and escalate their privilege to a higher privilege, such as that of an admin, to gain more access in the organization. T1486 is data encrypted for impact. This is kind of the key concept of ransomware, which is taking advantage of the fact that they're in the system, encrypting that data, and then using it to get a ransom paid. T1222 is file and directory permission modification. This is kind of in the same area as encryption for impact, but a little bit different because this is changing permissions to files, and this is also could be part of privilege escalation. And then T1190, exploiting vulnerabilities in public-facing applications. This is where things are not programmed with the idea of failure in mind or wrong inputs being inputted in mind. And this is where attacks such as SQL injection and other attacks like that will take advantage of the fact that these weren't prepared for that kind of input, and that'll cause attackers to be able to get access where they normally wouldn't be able to or shouldn't be able to. Very important things that we see are for third-party breaches. We see that third-party breaches and supply chain attacks are very common and are helping attackers target multiple different organizations with the same attack, as well as targeting third parties helps them get access to more secure organizations through less secure organizations that larger organization with better security would use as a vendor, taking advantage of the trust between these companies to use vendors to access the larger organizations, which is something we saw in the SolarWinds attack, which will be covered later in the video. So another key thing that we see um, is the extortion tactics that ransomware actors will use. The key being triple extortion. This is where they will steal information, encrypt it as the initial source of trying to get a ransom paid, and then they'll use extra tactics such as threatening to notify partners and shareholders, or threatening to increase their attack to cause operational disruption, or threatening to release that information publicly that would cause damage to the company and shareholders. Um, Another key thing about extortion tactics would be the risk of paying ransoms. FBI and CISA recommend against paying ransoms because it emboldens attackers and shows that these attacks work. Um, Another key thing is the smarter attacks or higher level attacks. This is using third-party breaches and supply chain vulnerabilities. And then another small but more in-depth or more effective attack that we see is the timing. Simply timing things during holidays can lead to better effects for attackers because there's less security defenders on site because it's a holiday. Let's talk about a case study, and that's going to be the Colonial Pipeline attack. This is a very, very notorious attack, very popular, happened in 2021 in May. And it kind of served as a cautionary tale for ransomware groups as well as a wake-up call for some companies. Um, so it was an attack on the Colonial Pipeline. The initial attack vector will be talked about in the next slide. But for the outcomes of this attack, we saw a lot of for the outcome of this attack, we saw a large ransom paid, which is almost $5 million paid in this ransom. Although the Department of Justice seized 2.3 million of that by tracking the transaction, despite it using bitcoins, they were able to track that and stop half of it. So the actors behind the attack was a ransomware group known as DarkSide, and they used very specific tactics on a lot of their attacks that a lot of other ransomware groups use, but are very effective. One of the key ones being reconnaissance. They look into systems, they use phishing, things like this to get information. And then once they're initially in a system and they deploy the ransomware, they use the information they've gained to better extort and use negotiation against these businesses. One of the key examples being businesses saying they couldn't afford ransom due to profits dropping during COVID, and DarkSide showing their business receipts and them actually being profitable during COVID and saying you can't afford to pay the ransom. Here's the proof. And this impact of this attack was vital and very, very important, especially both due to a wake-up call for companies because of the extent and cautionary tale of the ransomware to not target large businesses like this because it shut down a large amount of oil-related fuel sources on the East Coast, causing a fuel shortage and causing a lot of issues in that department, leading to a lot of unwanted attention to these ransomware companies. Sorry, ransomware groups. So the initial attack vector was very simple. It was actually a leaked password to a VPN sign-in. The attackers were able to use this sign-in without multi-factor authentication because it wasn't implemented and simply sign on and then begin their attack there. And this is actually very common. 77% of the energy sector has at least one leaked credential in the past couple of years. And then the effects of this attack led to DarkSide disbanding, and then other ransomware groups not posting ransomware in their forums anymore to avoid scrutiny. And then some of the key infiltration methods used by DarkSide for this attack was phishing, exploiting the remote access of the VPN, um, and that was very, very effective for how simple it was. Some things that could have mitigated this attack would be using multi-factor authentication. This would have made it harder for attackers to get in, although they still could have maybe access to email or used phishing to get that multi-factor authentication code, but it would have been an extra step. And then again, strong email filtering using DMARC and those other key email filtering things. Another very, very important one would just be keeping systems up to date, not allowing those CVEs to be released, which we see in a lot of these attacks and in general, organizing operational technology and information technology systems into different zones protected by different security. This involves not using a parameter defense model, but using a zero trust model, which will be talked about later. And then another very, very important thing is using proper backups and restoration practices. This means including a gold image of a system, frequently updating that image and keeping it separated, where if an attack is done on the main system, that backup is still protected and can be used to back up data that's encrypted, so the ransom doesn't have to be paid. So the next case study that I'm going to talk about is the SolarWinds attack, and this didn't involve ransomware, but it did involve, it is a third-party attack, which is very vital to understanding how bad actors think and how they use things to their advantage. And in this case, it's targeting a smaller vendor to get access to much, much more secure organizations just by using that trusted nature between the vendor and the organizations. So this company, SolarWinds, supplied a service to supplied IT services to many different organizations. Some of these being as large as the actual U.S. government and Microsoft. A lot of things like that we saw. They got access to those by using using the vendor organization relationship. So we know that the attack was done by Russian Foreign Intelligence Service. This is Russia's hacker team. So this would actually be politically a bit muddy due to the relationship between Russia and the US and the fact that it was done by Russian intelligence, not by Russian hackers. And the breach was caused by password guessing, spraying, and exploiting vulnerable admin credentials. Very common. Passwords get released, and the attacking groups can use these to get initial access, which then they can use for privilege escalation and deploying ransomware. To continue, some of the methods we saw were inserting the malware into SolarWinds source code. And by using this malware and taking advantage of the trust and SolarWinds actually signing off on their security updates, signing off on the updated code, and then sending it out with their stamp of approval. Companies didn't look at the actual code. They didn't look at if it was dangerous. They just trusted it and implemented it and did the updates. And by the attackers putting the malware in those updates, they infected many systems, getting information from all of those different organizations. And to deal with this attack, CISA had to release a 3-stage plan, both for level of severity. There were 3 different levels of severity. The third being fully infected with the malware being gone, the malware being implemented to this business's or organization's cloud system, and the extent for evicting those securities or evicting those bad actors from systems and making sure that the systems were both secure, malware free, and ready to go back online. So some important mitigation measures that could have been done in this instance were SolarWind to rigorously vet and test their code, as well as organizations to vet and test their entire software supply chain. If vendors aren't holding themselves accountable, the larger organizations that use those vendors have to hold the vendors accountable. Otherwise, these kind of attacks are just going to happen more and more often because that trust is just going to be abused. And if organizations aren't making sure that their lower organizations are protected, they're actually themselves leaving a large vulnerability in their own security. And by implementing the vendors technology, they're actually increasing their attack surface. Um, some other things could be network segmentation and access control measures. These would be things such as splitting the OT and IT networks, as well as using a zero trust model over a conventional parameter model, because a parameter model does not block attackers once they're inside. They can easily escalate their privileges and be able to do these attacks. But a zero trust model keeps the network segmented with different types of security. So bad actors can't go into a system and abuse that system uh, with one breach. They have to get through multiple layers of security constantly to do these things. So as an observation and discussion of these slides, we saw that mitigation of ransomware requires better security, improved knowledge about vulnerabilities, and a large shift in the industry mindset regarding how we see security. So from what we've seen, especially with the Colonial Pipeline attack, basic vulnerabilities can lead to devastating breaches. So a single leaked password and the not using multi-factor authentication led to a $5 million attack and much more hidden costs, such as the cost of fuel going up and the long amount of time that they had to shut down to ensure they weren't infected further in their systems. This also shows the importance of using multi-factor authentication and training users, strong security passwords, not falling for phishing emails. It also gives a large amount of importance to the zero trust model. The data-centric model um, and focusing on a higher level of security than trusting a parameter model to safely and securely protect data. So a few other things that we can see with these are compliance checklists, such as NSIT, NIST's, and CISA's compliance checklist for security, not being able to keep up with evolving threats, as well as companies not truly respecting and committing to those guidelines, such as keeping things up to date. Very simple measures that are often overlooked or not done by companies that leave them vulnerable. Three components to mitigation that we saw, or that was released by CISA, would be prevention, response, and recovery. Prevention is having systems be up to date, protecting passwords, having good practice in basic security being strong. Response is having response plans, being able to respond quickly and accurately to attacks and be able to prevent the damage done during the attack as it's happening. And recovery is the ability to recover after attacks. This is good practice, such as having gold images of systems and having guidelines for recovery in this instance. Not only just recovering systems, but also kind of in tandem with response, dealing with these threats. This would include having separate data and system backups off-site, not connected to the original attack, the original attack surface. And then another thing that we saw, additive security is a big risk when it's not tested. By adding security such as IT services or even malware protection, data protection, other things like this actually can increase the attack surface of an organization. And by increasing attack surface, you give more vulnerabilities for attackers to find. So additive security is a risk because by adding more components to our organization to protect it, we can actually leave more holes to be exploited. And leaving these holes to be exploited can actually outweigh the benefits of having these additive security measures. Another key thing to protecting systems would be expecting failure. So if we design products with failure in mind, they work with less privilege, and when they fail, systems can still function without them. Uh, and this can be very important for when ransomware shuts down systems, or when certain systems are breached, we can shut that system down without completely making a mess of everything. And then another important thing is the need for accountability. If we don't value security and safety and accountability for attacks, we're just going to see a lot more attacks happen. Um, and if we don't value security over profit, then businesses will have no justification to take extra time losing profit for security, which leads to a large amount of vulnerabilities that aren't patched simply due to not wanting to have downtime or lose profit. Some insights from case studies that we can see would be real world impacts of these attacks. This can be such as the shutdown of oil supply from the Colonial Pipeline being the cause of the ransomware attack, and the wide-ranging scale, the wide-ranging effects of that. Not only the cost of the original ransom, but also all the hidden costs of that attack. This also gives us an important to the basic security, which I previously talked about. This is just if we implement basic security, we can have stronger security. But you need that baseline of security to build off of. If we don't use multi-factor authentication, we can't have a secure system, as well as the zero trust models and the importance of those, which I've also highlighted. If we expect a outside perimeter defense model to protect inside, that is just simply not effective, as once attackers penetrate the original line of defense, they can have full range of access to a system compared to needing to penetrate multiple lines of defense each time they try to do a different each time they try to access different data or get access to something that they're not supposed to have access to. Another key factor and importance to mitigating some of these attacks would be phishing training and email security protocols. A lot of attacks via phishing are just due to poor training or people not taking security seriously. If we implement more training, there'll be stronger people. And even when those email security protocols fail, employees won't fall for phishing tactics. And then authorization is another key thing that we need to focus on. Authorization being part of zero trust models, being that authorization is required for multiple steps, not just on the outside or original sign-in. It's also required each time a different action of importance takes place. While this takes away from usability, it adds a lot to security, which makes it worth the trade-off. And then preventing privilege escalation is what that authorization factor would do. By authorizing multiple different actions, privilege escalation is made much, much harder by attackers because they have to do that multi-factor authentication multiple times instead of just once. And they can't just use the password and then immediately have access. To conclude, we need to implement strong security practices and have a zero trust mindset when we approach security. This is very important because it can prevent attacks from happening. Strengthening basic security can lead us to having a strong foundation, which we can then use advanced security technologies on top of. If we don't have a strong foundation, it'll be very hard to build a strong system on top of that. And then again, collaborative efforts for the future are very important. We need more research. We need more people looking into these flaws and more people changing their viewpoints on security as a whole in order to better take care of these flaws. And then these are my references. Thank you for listening to my presentation. I appreciate it very much. If you have any questions, you can look at my paper and email me at the email address listed there. Thank you.